Today is Friday, January 7th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Several days ago, I posted on social media and said that I was going to take some time to discuss the controversy, at least online, because this controversy doesn't exist offline. But it's pretty distracting and irritating online, and that's the controversy of this whole traditional Catholic argument against the Pope and the bishops, against the Second Vatican Council, and so on, where there's a crowd of people online gathered around really 3 or 4 online personalities who spend all of their time criticizing the Pope, criticizing the bishops, talking about the Second Vatican Council, and they do so through childish memes and images, lots of emotion, foul language. I don't think I've ever seen as much foul language. I don't see any foul language on my social media accounts other than from people who claim to be traditional Catholics. And because they're just so, angry and frustrated, they think that because their cause is just, that the use of foul language is justified. Of course, arguing that the end justifies the means. But what they actually reveal when we see their ugly outbursts, we see that what's underneath this talk about a concern for tradition and reverence and so on is a spirit that's very contrary to the Spirit of Christ. There's something wrong there, and the behavior reveals that reality. Jesus said to beware of false prophets. And strangely enough, these folks suggest that the false prophets are actually the successors to the apostles, the actual hierarchy of the church. And they imagine that the people that they follow on the internet, who spend their lives criticizing and scoffing at those actual members of the hierarchy of the church, are not the false prophets, but that the bishops and the Pope are the false prophets, and their handful of online talking heads, self-appointed YouTubers, are the true prophets. And as crazy as that may sound, they imagine that they can prove that the leaders of the church are false prophets because of the so-called fruits of the Second Vatican Council. And what they mean by that is because there has been a decline in Catholic culture since the 1970s. That decline should be credited to the Second Vatican Council and can therefore be called the fruits of that council, and they can then argue that those fruits prove that the council was false or wasn't God's will, was some kind of man-made attack on quote-unquote traditional Catholicism. Now the problem with this argument, and this is only for people who are actually willing to reason. I already know that there's a mob among these folks who they don't care one bit whether what they say is irrational or not. I'm not even going to worry about those people. I'm offering this response to people who still are sensitive enough to listen to reason. If you make the argument that events that take place after the Second Vatican Council are caused by the Second Vatican Council, I can guarantee that though you claim to be a traditional Catholic, you have never studied the art of reasoning. I can guarantee that you have never formally studied or made an effort to study Aristotle's Organon, which is the source for the art of reasoning. Because no one who has studied the art of reasoning would possibly suggest that because events come after another event, that those events can be said to be caused by that prior event. In fact, this is one of the logical fallacies that are always listed among false arguments. It's called the post hoc fallacy. The fallacy suggests that because this came after that, that is the cause of this. And that kind of argument is sophistical to an uneducated, unreasonable person, especially a person who is prejudiced and wants a certain thing to be true. It appears reasonable enough for them to accept it or pretend to accept it. And the nature of sophistical arguments is that they are not actually reasonable. They simply have an illusion of being reasonable. They're able to trick the ignorant and unsuspecting, and they're sufficient to be used by deceivers, by men who aren't actually interested in reasoning, but simply want to manipulate and deceive other people. This argument that because certain things happen in the Church after the Second Vatican Council, that the Second Vatican Council is actually the cause of those events, when no causality can be demonstrated. This is a sophistical argument. And like I said, if anyone would study the art of reasoning, which is what traditional Catholics did through history, they would know that. And they would quickly reject any such argument that's made, or at the very least, they would demand that causality be demonstrated. So, for example, if the Second Vatican Council, just for the sake of simplicity, was conducted in 1970, and we looked at statistics that showed that after 1970, mass attendance began to decline, or the numbers of people leaving the Catholic faith began to increase. If someone were to come along and say, we can show that the number of people attending Mass declined after the Second Vatican Council, and the number of people leaving the Catholic faith increased after the Second Vatican Council. Therefore, the Second Vatican Council is the cause of these statistics. There would be no proof. That would be a sophistical argument. Now, a simpleton could fall for that. A person who wants to detract and speak against the hierarchy of the church would be in agreement with that. But it would not be reasonable. Nothing was proven. Causality was not proven. You're simply saying that these events took place after that event. But you're not proving any causality. And to assume causality is not reasonable. The reality, as we consider the Second Vatican Council, is that the effects that follow the years of the Council prove the wisdom of the Church. Now, if you were going to prove that the Second Vatican Council caused declines in Mass attendance or increases in people leaving the Catholic Church, if you wanted to prove that the Second Vatican Council was the cause of those events, what you would need to do is isolate the Second Vatican Council as the only possible variable, the only possible factor contributing to those results. You would have to somehow isolate the Second Vatican Council as the only possible cause. There could be no other variables in society that might contribute to those effects. There could be no outside movement, let's say a political movement, or a cultural movement, or a socio-economic change that might explain or contribute to these changes. You would have to argue that everything remained exactly the same, that the only thing that changed was this Second Vatican Council and the reforms made to the liturgy and so on, and that with everything the same, these changes followed because they were caused by the Second Vatican Council. Now, it's obvious to anyone who's not insane that no one can possibly suggest that the only thing that changed between between the Catholic Church before the 1970s and the Catholic Church after the 1970s was the Second Vatican Council. No one would even attempt to suggest that the only change in society affecting Catholic people was the Second Vatican Council. No one would suggest that. But that is the suggestion. That is the assumption of anyone who claims that the events that followed the Second Vatican Council were in fact the fruits of the Second Vatican Council. As ridiculous as that argument is, it's the argument in the mouths of thousands of people. Now, to make that argument, you've got to have some mental problems to make that argument, to even pretend that the Second Vatican Council was the only change and the only possible cause, therefore, of events that followed. You'd have to be nuts. There's no possible way that you could demonstrate any such thing to be true. But even worse, it's not even possible. There have been so many changes. Let's say since the 1930s, there have been so many philosophical, cultural, economic, philosophical changes in society that have taken place that it's ridiculous to suggest that you can identify the cause of changes in modern Catholic life. For example, in the 1950s, television was invented. And suddenly, information and culture and ideas could be broadcast into the living rooms of every home. Something that was never done in the history of the world. Not to mention radio, which came first. But we have the introduction of television into the center of the American home. You're going to suggest that that had no influence on the culture? It's ridiculous. Then we have the fact that America and much of the world was recovering from decades of horrible war, where millions and millions of people were killed and people were questioning the purpose of life itself. You had the introduction of nuclear weapons. The entire nature of politics and war was suddenly brought into confusion. That didn't have any effect on the psyche of modern American Catholics. You had the whole cultural revolution, the sexual revolution of the 1960s. You had the legalization of abortion, the advent and promotion of birth control, where all of the natural obstacles to promiscuity and sex outside of marriage suddenly became possible. You don't think that had any effect on the decisions and behavior of American Catholic people? You had clerical abuse scandals that rocked the church. You don't think those things had an effect on Catholic people in America? In the 1990s, we've had the rise of the internet. We've had the proliferation of 24/7 access to free entertainment. From the simplest access to music and books, all the way to the most terrible pornographic materials at our fingertips 24 hours a day. You don't think that these things, these external changes, have had any influence on Catholic people in modern society? To suggest that nothing has changed between the time of Catholics living in the early 1900s and Catholics living at the end of the 1900s, or even by the middle of the 1900s, is just impossible to even take seriously. And to suggest that the changes in society, the lack of interest in religion in general, the lack of interest in marriage, the lack of interest in childbearing and family life. All of these things, which happened at the same time that we see a decline in Catholic Mass attendance, were caused by the Second Vatican Council. Was the decline in Protestant church attendance also caused by the Second Vatican Council? Was the decline in attendance in Jewish synagogues in America also caused by the Second Vatican Council? Because all of these things happened at the same time. It's not true that since the Second Vatican Council there has been a decline in Catholicism. There has been a decline in religion, period, in the last 100 years. There has been a decline in Protestant religion. There has been a decline in Jewish religion in the past 100 years. Are these things also caused by the Second Vatican Council? Or is it more obviously true that there are greater influential factors outside of the Church that have challenged religion, have challenged faith, have challenged traditional morality, and that these things are actually the causes of the problems that are being blamed on the Second Vatican Council? The fact that the same changes that took place within the Catholic Church also took place outside of the Catholic Church proves the truth. Since the early 1900s, Western civilization itself has been under attack by a number of different forces, secular forces. These range from ideas like communism to issues like contraception, homosexuality, on and on. All of these modern issues have caused radical changes in human thought and behavior, in social organization, family life, economics, on and on and on. These are the actual causes of the changes that we see in our society. Now, what I would propose to any reasonable person is to consider that in the early 1900s, the Church was moved by the grace of God to foresee these changes, these influences that were developing in society, not only in America but throughout the world. And the Church was led to call the Second Vatican Council to make preparations for this attack that was coming. We see popes like Leo XIII and Pius X warning of these coming changes, warning of these external influences that were threatening the Catholic faith. We see talk about what's called modernism, though traditional Catholics don't understand what modernism actually is. We see these warnings being made in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And we see the Church gathering in the middle of the 1900s and making changes. I would propose that these changes made at the Second Vatican Council will in time prove to have saved the Catholic Church from problems that are going to completely overwhelm and destroy other religious communities. You can watch and see what happens, for example, to the Anglican Church. You can watch and see what happens increasingly to evangelical churches or to Jewish communities. And for all the criticism, the Catholic Church, with all things considered, continues internationally to grow and be strong. And what I would recommend you think about is this. What if the forces that came into society in the mid to late 1900s would have destroyed Catholicism had it remained strictly with its traditional practices and culture? What if the Second Vatican Council actually saved Catholicism from the attacks that would come? What if the changes, the reforms of the Second Vatican Council were not merely the good ideas and strategies of men, but were actually the effects of the grace of God in preserving the Church from changing times? What if in the 1970s these changes were beyond the comprehension even of those making them, and this led to abuses and confusion within the Church, but that over time those abuses would be cleaned up, the intentions and the meaning of the Second Vatican Council would be studied and understood and explained more clearly. And as we enter into the 21st century, we would begin to see the Church emerge stronger and holier and more united than ever before. Because that's, in fact, what we are seeing. One of the deceptions about this criticism of the hierarchy of the Church is that it bases these accusations against the hierarchy of the Church on the experience of American Catholics in isolated places. And it projects these experiences, these American problems, onto the world, as if the Pope is dealing with these same issues everywhere the Catholic Church exists. Americans have a difficult time thinking about anything other than American life. The Church has grown to number over 1.3 billion people in the 21st century. Why isn't this attributed to, or why isn't this considered one of the fruits of the Second Vatican Council, that the Catholic Church remains the largest religious community on the planet? I think the statistics are 1 in 7 people on earth, maybe even 1 in 6, identify as Roman Catholics. And of course, people may respond to that and say, yeah, well, who cares if you identify as a Catholic? You're not a real Catholic. No, these are people who identify as Catholic rather than anything else. One in 7, maybe 1 in 6, I forget the number. But the number is 1.3 billion people are identified as Roman Catholic on earth. Why isn't that attributed to the Second Vatican Council? Why isn't the continued growth and development and strengthening of the Catholic Church globally attributed to the Second Vatican Council? Are we going to say that because the number of people attending Mass in some small town in New Jersey is proof that the Second Vatican Council was false? Just think of how ridiculous that is. And I often see these accusations made like the Novus Ordo parishes are empty, no one's going to Mass anymore, no young people are interested in modern Catholic Church, modern Catholic families aren't having any children anymore. These assertions that are made, again, by people on the internet, have no support in real life on the ground. I attend a parish. We're in the middle of Monroe, North Carolina. We're in rural North Carolina. I attend a modern Catholic parish that has over 2,000 families registered. We have sacramental classes for children where there are hundreds and hundreds of children receiving the sacraments. We have 4 or 5 Masses every Sunday that are packed. I don't know what anyone's talking about who says that these modern parishes are all empty and that there's no interest in the Catholic faith. They're literally making stuff up. Parishes are packed. I've never gone to confession once where I didn't have to wait in line to make confession. I simply don't understand where these people get their information from. Go to the local Catholic parish. I guarantee it's filled with people on a Sunday morning. I don't know where these accusations are coming from because they're simply not true. But if you spend all of your time on the internet, I guess you can be led to believe that things are other than they actually are. And that's part of the problem. I think people are getting so wrapped up in this craziness that they're becoming more and more internet-oriented. And as they become more and more centered about information on the internet, they're becoming less and less aware of what's actually going on off the internet. And it's becoming easier and easier to deceive them because they don't even know what's true outside anymore. You can just tell them, oh, you know what's happening in modern churches? They're all emptying. No one's even going to the modern Masses anymore. Modern Catholic families aren't even having kids anymore. And the dopes on the internet read it and imagine that it's true. I can name 2 families other than my own. I have 10 children, and I go to a modern Novus Ordo diocesan parish. I know 2 other families. I know a family that has 13 children. As far as I know, they go to a modern parish. I know another family that has 9 children. They attend a modern parish. I don't know where this argument is coming from, but it's false. I know my parish is packed. I know the largest parish in all of America is 30 minutes away from my home in Charlotte. It's a modern diocesan parish, the largest parish in America, packed. I don't know what anyone's talking about. These accusations aren't true. And like I said, there's 1.3 billion Catholics in the world. Why isn't that attributed to the Second Vatican Council? So these arguments that are commonly made are just not possible to demonstrate or prove. There's no causality established by anyone who suggests that the Second Vatican Council caused any local problem. The other tactic that these folks make on the internet, and this is led by clowns like Taylor Marshall, because he is a clown. Just think about it. This man was an Anglican. No one asked him to enter the Catholic Church. He chose to convert to Catholicism. As an Anglican, he could have entered the church and become a priest. If he was so interested in the liturgy and the sacraments and the priesthood, he had the opportunity, the rare opportunity, I would even say the exclusive opportunity, to enter the Catholic Church and serve as a priest. And he chose not to. So I don't want to hear about his great concern for the sacraments and the liturgy. He chose not to be a priest in the Catholic Church. He entered the Catholic Church, I assume, out of an interest in being united with the head, the visible head of the Catholic Church, which is the Pope, and being a member of the Catholic laity. Obviously, what was available to him in the Anglican Church was not sufficient, and what was available in the living Catholic Church was considered more sufficient. But since he's entered the Catholic Church, he's essentially devoted himself to selling books that criticize the Catholic Church. He spends his time on YouTube, and I don't watch his video, but I see other people sharing the videos. I see the topics and the issues. He's basically like an online gossip. It's like the National Enquirer for Catholics. He gleans articles off the internet that disrespect and dishonor the hierarchy of the church. And he works to make sure that Catholic people see bad examples of isolated Catholic practices and then attributes those bad practices to the Pope and bishops as if they're the causes of them. And what's the purpose of this so-called ministry? What's the purpose? Is he leading to a greater respect for the papacy? Is he promoting greater obedience, more holiness, more active service in the church? Remember, this is a man who chose not to participate in the priesthood. What's the purpose of this online gossip? What these people do is they'll scour the internet or receive leads from people who sit idly on the internet looking for embarrassing stories of isolated individual priests or churches. And while these are isolated, individual, in no way characteristic examples of anything that's being done in the church, they'll promote and spread these images, these videos, these stories all over the internet and make them feel like they're universal and local. Make them feel like this is what's going on in the church today. And what's the purpose of this work? What's the purpose of this gossip? To get people upset? To make people angry? To encourage people to complain? What's the purpose? What's the actual good of this newsmongering and gossip? If this isn't gossip, what is gossip? This is just effeminate, lazy, idle gossip. So we spread stories and pictures and videos that we find on the internet that no one in the church is experiencing. And we pass them around and use these as proofs that our criticism of the hierarchy of the church is justified. But here's the problem. If these problems that you claim to exist are so prevalent, why are the examples so isolated and few? Why are the same 5 videos or 6 pictures constantly shared and reshared if these things are happening everywhere? Why do we need a video from South America showing some individual priest doing something wrong if this is being done everywhere, all over the place, as a result of the Second Vatican Council? Why do I need to see a video from 4 years ago to show me that something wrong is being done in the Catholic Church? Isn't this being done all over the place every Sunday? If your arguments are true, why don't you show me a video from this past weekend? Why don't you show me a video from your own town? Show us that these things are prevalent. Show us that these things are common. Show us that these things are characteristic. Because if all you can do is find isolated instances of these things by searching the internet, and you have to constantly pass around this same limited number of isolated instances, what you're doing is actually proving that you are false. If all you have to show are these isolated incidents from all over the globe, the fact that you have to show such an isolated selection of YouTube videos to try to make your case proves that you actually have no case. Let's make a rule. If you'd like to show that there are abuses in the church that are prevalent and common, that are present everywhere and being experienced by Catholics all over the place, let's make a rule. You're only allowed to share a video from your own town. You're only allowed to share a video from the past month. So if you'd like to prove that these abuses are prevalent everywhere and are common, you have to show that it took place in your town in the past month. And that's the only evidence that can be accepted, since the claim is that these problems are always and everywhere true. Let the proof then be from your own town and from the past month. Anything that's offered from previous years doesn't prove that these problems are present or prevalent. Anything that's offered from other cities, other states, other countries does not prove that these things are prevalent and common. In fact, it proves you have no actual evidence that they are prevalent and present and common. They prove exactly the opposite. It would be like me saying, tigers are everywhere. Tigers are spreading through America. Tigers are filling all of the suburbs, they're in the streets, they're in all of the rural areas, harassing residents. Tigers are everywhere. And then to prove that, I post a video from India from 2018 showing a tiger attacking someone. Would you accept that as proof that tigers are attacking and menacing people all over the world, everywhere? Or would that video prove the opposite to be the truth? That because there is no evidence except this isolated instance from several years ago in a country far away, that there actually is no problem with tigers anywhere. Yet this is what we see among this so-called traditional Catholic community. The isolated nature of the evidence proves the contrary and shows these people just to be a bunch of desperate gossips. Desperate. They can't find evidence for their claims anywhere. Desperate. One example from the Christmas season was I think it was a Christmas Eve Mass celebrated in Chicago. Well, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't know why I would need an example from Chicago, Illinois, to prove to me that there are abuses taking place everywhere all the time in the Catholic Church. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. Show me a problem. Show me a problem in Charlotte. Show me a problem. There are dozens of churches. Show me a problem. Why do I care that you can find one problem in Chicago, Illinois? There are 70 million Catholics in America. You have to go to Chicago, Illinois to find an example of something that you don't like? And besides, with the celebration in Chicago, what was the problem? What was the problem? You don't like the culture? You don't like the style of music or a dance? Who cares? What does that have to do with anything? Maybe there was an issue where the hosts were in a dish. I think I might have seen this. The hosts were in a dish on the altar, and the priest or a parishioner bumped into the dish accidentally, and it tipped over on the altar. Well, that was an accident. Obviously, they should have been more careful. Okay, I'll grant you that. But what does that prove? That proves something about the Second Vatican Council or about the Novus Ordo Mass? Or does it simply prove that you happen to catch one person in a video being clumsy? Have you ever heard the story that was told by Archbishop Fulton Sheen about the time when he dropped, I think it was the chalice, while he was an altar server? Maybe even a seminarian. I think it was when he was a child. He dropped the chalice, and he was scared at what would happen, and the priest that he was assisting responded with gentleness and told him that it was no problem because it was an accident. And then he tells a story about another boy who once did something similar and was scolded and humiliated, and that other boy grew up to become Joseph Stalin. You know the point that Archbishop Sheen makes in that story? It's that strictness and a lack of mercy, a lack of forbearance is not the Christian spirit. Because you can find a clumsy person on video who does something stupid at a Mass, says absolutely nothing about the Mass, says nothing about the Second Vatican Council. Are you seriously going to present that as evidence that the Second Vatican Council and the Novus Ordo Mass has a problem? Because you can find an isolated individual making a clumsy mistake in a city far away on one specific event? Can you be that unreasonable? Can you be irrational enough to suggest that that isolated incident proves your universal assertion? Like I said, anyone who even entertains that argument has never studied the art of reasoning and is irrational. You cannot make a universal conclusion with a particular premise. That's just the simplest, most basic lesson in reasoning. You cannot make or prove a universal conclusion if you use a particular premise. So there's no case. There's no case. And all of this gossip, National Enquirer, Catholic News, spread through YouTube and social media, it's just an embarrassment to the people who spread it. It's embarrassing that somebody could be that dumb to think that a video of an isolated problem could be used to prove a universal assertion. It's painfully embarrassing to realize that people can be that dumb. Now, I could go on for hours pointing out the contradictions and irrational arguments made by these people. But what I'd like to do is stop with that because I've already talked for 50 minutes. I could go on and on and on because these examples of irrational craziness are just manufactured constantly, even by the celebrities that they follow. The people are crazy. They're not even intelligent, rational people. They're gossipy people who are, first of all, they're idle in terms of what they actually do. They're usually serving their own personal book writing ministry or business, whatever you want to call it. They're interested in being conference speakers and selling their books or selling ads on all of their YouTube videos and scrounging for any kind of dirty money they can get their hands on. They're trying to get into parishes so they can promote their books and speak in churches as if that's appropriate. They see the church as a market. They see the church as a market. They see its members as possible customers. They have no real interest in the hierarchy and order of the church itself. They target the common people just like Martin Luther did. They target the common people with all their arguments. And their interests are only personal. And the self-contradictions and ridiculous, irrational statements that they make never stop. They also rely on all kinds of obscure historical arguments as if history can ever be used as a source of demonstration. These people just don't know the art of reasoning. And it's okay because the people that they target don't know it either. And that's why they target them, because they know that they don't know it. But what I'd like to do is talk to any of you who may be wrapped up in this traditional Catholic stuff, following all of these traditional Catholic book writers and YouTube gurus, and you're upset. You're upset to see the Pope being disrespected. You're upset to see people talking about the church like wild, crazy Protestants from the 1500s. You're upset to see people on the verge of schism. And maybe by the grace of God, you're having doubts and are feeling a sense of discomfort with what's going on in these communities of people claiming to be traditional Catholics. You see the filthy language that they speak with. You see how disrespectful they are towards the authority of the church. You see them constantly trying to sell stuff to people. How many new books do we need criticizing and attacking the church? This really needs to be spread through a book that people have to pay for. If people have the truth to teach, will they charge money for it? If these things cause you to be concerned, as they should, I'd like to offer an alternative to you, for you to consider. First of all, I want to encourage you, if you're going to assume anything, you should assume that the Pope and the bishops in union with the Pope, not some maverick bishop on his own, but if you are to assume anything, assume that the Pope and the bishops in union with the Pope are true. Assume that they're true. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Not the gossips, not the newsmongers, not the detractors, not the schismatics. Give them no benefit of any doubt. Make them prove everything they say against the church. If they make a claim against the church, make them prove it. Don't accept an isolated example as a proof of a universal claim. That's irrational. If they make a claim that this or that is happening everywhere, demand that they demonstrate that it's true and give them no benefit of a doubt. But if you're going to assume anything and give anyone the benefit of the doubt, you must give it to the Pope and to the bishops who speak in union with the Pope. If you're going to assume anything, assume that the Second Vatican Council was true and good. Assume that maybe its significance was profound and inspired and is still being studied and understood more and more as these events of modern times unfold. And we're seeing an example of the Holy Spirit leading the church through crises that the church itself doesn't understand. Isn't that the whole point of the Catholic Church? Assume that a council of the church is true and good. Give it the benefit of the doubt. Assume that your bishop, who is a Catholic priest to begin with, who has served the church by his own will for decades and decades, who likely chose to become a priest when he was a young man and could have done 100 other things, but chose to devote his life to the church, assume that he's a good man. Assume that he loves the church. Assume that he's more concerned with the church and the liturgy and the sacraments than somebody who chose not to be a priest. Assume that a bishop who chose to live a celibate life for the sake of the church is a good man. And assume that a person who is willing to promote gossip and try to dishonor someone else, like these people do on the internet, assume that they are not good men. Because good men aren't gossips. Good men don't share bad stories about other men to try to embarrass them. Good men don't make irrational arguments and try to argue that because I can find an isolated instance of something bad, that proves a general claim that things are bad everywhere. Only a bad man would make an argument like that. Assume that your bishop was chosen for his office for a reason. Don't allow some stupid conspiracy theory, some false assumption to pollute your thoughts or corrupt your thoughts about the leaders of the church. Even if it could be shown that leaders in the church have committed sins, that doesn't justify the conclusions that they're false leaders who can be disobeyed and disrespected, who can be spoken against and ignored. Because a leader in the church commits a personal sin has no effect on the authority of his office and your obligation to honor it with obedience and respect. Anyone who you see speaking disrespectfully about bishops or the Pope or cardinals is obviously out of line. You won't find any writings of saints that do this. Do you think John Bosco would have been on the internet passing around YouTube videos embarrassing a priest? You think Padre Pio would be on YouTube writing publicly about how he disagrees with what the Pope said about this or that, or sharing links to embarrassing pictures or communicating with memes? The reason why these people often have to communicate with memes and illustrations is because they have no actual evidence. They have to literally draw up their own evidence, because there is no actual evidence. How old are you before you stop looking to memes to make your case? That's for children. You need to grow up and act like an adult. If you're going to assume that anyone is good, assume that the Pope is good, who's been given the chair of St. Peter in the providence of God. And realize that if you're going to assume bad things about the Pope, then you must also assume bad things about God himself. If you're going to assume bad things about the bishops of the church, you're also assuming bad things about Christ himself. And don't let yourself explain it away. Don't let your pride or your emotions or your selfish desires allow you to explain these bad behaviors away. When Jesus spoke of the false prophets and warned, he said, they will be known by their fruits. You want to know what the fruits are? The fruits are their behavior, their foul language, their gossiping, their detracting, their disrespect, their unreasonableness, their false arguments, their misrepresentation of issues, their desire to find bad stories and promote them, to blow issues out of proportion and cause things to appear true that aren't in fact true. These are the fruits that identify the false prophets. You don't see the Pope doing that. You don't see any bishops doing these things. You don't see bishops mocking anyone with memes. You don't see bishops posting foul-mouthed rants on the internet. The people you see doing these things are the false teachers and the false believers. And don't let yourself be deceived to think that people who are doing things that you know holy men would never do are the true teachers. If you find yourself at that point, you've been deceived. And it's obvious that many people have been deceived. If you've gotten yourself trapped in that mess, I really don't know how you're going to get out of it. I don't understand why people get into it in the first place. And when you do get into it, especially when you've filled your children's heads with all this garbage, your children have listened to you badmouth priests and bishops and popes. Your children have been taught this critical, gossiping spirit. How are you going to get yourself out of that? How are you going to now turn around and tell your kids, don't do that? You're digging yourself such a deep hole. And these things are such serious vices that I don't know how you're not terrified of being trapped in these things and not being able to get yourself out. And even if you do get yourself out, how do you plan on getting your children out? How do you plan on ever rebuilding your children's trust in the Catholic Church? How do you plan on helping your child when he enters young adulthood and is challenged by the entire secular world to scoff at the Catholic Church? How are you going to edify and strengthen him when you've trained him to be critical of and disrespectful towards the hierarchy of the Church? How in the world are you going to get out of this mess? I don't know how people aren't terrified to participate in any kind of behavior which would lead your children down a path that they might never come back from. Remember, when you criticize the church and you think that it's safe for you to criticize the church because you imagine that you're a Christian, and so you're criticizing the church from the vantage point of, let's say, a Christian position. And so you think it may be justified. But that spirit of criticism is going to fill your children, maybe your relatives, maybe your co-workers, maybe other Christian people. And what's going to happen when they're tempted to not criticize the church from the vantage point of a Christian, but from the secular world? How are you going to restrain the criticism that fills them with confidence when they consider up and leaving the Catholic Church altogether? How are you going to restore their faith in the Catholic Church? To see these people bad-mouthing bishops and popes, spreading false stories all over the internet about the church, making universal accusations against the church using isolated instances, this is the stuff of false accusers. And I just don't understand how anyone cannot be scared to death of that kind of behavior, considering the effects that it's going to have on others, and the fact that those effects can't be taken back. There are times where I would like to say something critical, let's say about a priest or a homily or something, but I'll refrain because I don't want my kids to have an example of disrespectful talk towards a member of the clergy. If I see something embarrassing or funny at Mass, I won't talk about it because I don't want my kids to think that we go to Mass to look for things to joke about. I have to think about what the effects would be of things I say and things I do, even online. I have to think about what the effects would be of anything that I share or post. God forbid that anyone could blame me for leading them to lose faith in the Catholic Church. And I just don't know how some of you folks do the things you do without being terrified of the effects that it could have. And so if you've still got any conscience left in you, I recommend that you get away from this schismatic stuff as fast as you can. Block these people on social media, get away from their YouTube channels, throw away their books, go back to the scriptures, go back to the catechism, read the writings of the doctors of the church, and get rid of all of this junk. First of all, because you don't need it in the first place, and second, because it's evil. There's so much available to you that's pure and good. Sacred Scripture is infallible, the inspired Word of God. Why not make that your reading material? If you want to pray, pray the Liturgy of the Hours. Pray the Rosary. Meditate on the mysteries of the Rosary. Get rid of all these garbage books. Get off these YouTube channels. Unsubscribe from these stupid gossip channels. If you've got time for online reading, go read the writings of Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine. Read the writings of St. Teresa of Avila and the doctors of the church. Why are you reading this junk in the first place? If you have nothing better to do than sit and watch YouTube videos, why not just turn the computer off and go to bed? Go for a jog. Go clean the house. Go work on your finances. Do something useful. Eliminate this idle time that's got you just letting all of this junk into your head. I won't be offended if you unsubscribe from my YouTube channel and don't listen to these talks. It's okay. But you've got to break the bad habits that have gotten you into these things in the first place. You've got to purify your life. Sanctify your devotional life, your reading list. Devote yourself to more serious studies. And I'll leave with this. If you need a place for those studies, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is free. It's free for this very purpose. It's what we're supposed to be doing with our spare time. Not looking for gossip stories and trying to see who has been able to find the worst video. But study philosophy, study reasoning, study languages, study scripture, study history. Make better use of your time, because what you're doing, if you're being led into this traditional Catholic schismatic gossip, you're on a bad road. And you can disagree with me, that's fine, but like I encourage you to do, prove it. Prove it. Because I'm calling your bluff. I don't think that you can prove any of the things that you assert. And if you'd like to prove it, then I invite you to do so. I'm calling your bluff. I don't think that you can prove the things that you say about the Catholic Church. And if you think I'm wrong, prove it.